Welcome to World Prophecy News. I'm Steve Gallimore.
And I'm Jay Gallimore, and today we want to talk about politics, and it's swirling all around us right now, Steve, in a big way, and religion is another huge issue again in the political election in the United States. In fact, it just, anybody that reads Revelation chapter 13 knows that this whole thing is going to end up with a religious emphasis. So what do we have today that tells us that this thing is just growing and the interest in politics and religion is just so huge?
Well, we are in a political year in the U.S., and when that happens, of course, you have the various religious issues that come up, the conflict between evangelicals and those that do not agree with the evangelicals, those that agree with the Roman Catholics, those that do not, and how all these issues filter into the political system, and then how do people that are members of these various religious organizations make their determination about how they're going to vote. And so all of those kinds of issues are really swirling around us right now. There is a recent interview that was done with an individual that's a Roman Catholic that I think is intriguing, that helps us understand some of the issues that are being dealt with.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. In fact, his name is Jim Heft. He's a Roman Catholic scholar and priest, and he has some advice for Catholics that are thinking about voting. And then we're going to talk about some evangelicals and some of their attitudes towards this.
Well, he says that a thoughtful Roman Catholic, his analysis of the whole thing, is that a thoughtful Roman Catholic is politically, using his terminology, is politically homeless.
Well, that's interesting because certainly both Democrats and Republicans try for that Catholic vote, whatever that means, put that in quote, and there's some questions what that means. But he wants, what does he want? Social justice Republicans and what was the other thing? He had pro-life Democrats. That's an interesting one.
Right. He basically, it seems, is saying that Catholics need to look for issues to guide them rather than parties to guide them in who they're going to vote for.
Right. What's some of the advice that he gives? Maybe the first one he says is that there are few guidelines to tell Catholic voters how to vote. Some of us kind of find that interesting when one of the political candidates, John Kerry, was basically denied communion, or told he was going to be denied communion in certain Catholic dioceses. And he went to a very liberal Roman Catholic church in Massachusetts in order to receive communion. And there's increasingly talk about how Catholic politicians are going to have to toe the Catholic line if they're going to get Catholic support. So that's kind of an interesting thing, that there's no guidelines coming up. Certainly abortion would be a guideline, I would think.
Right. Well, he has 4 observations that he says Catholics should keep in mind, and this is the first one. The second one is also kind of intriguing, and that is that he says that Catholicism is a public religion.
Now, what does that mean?
I don't know. I'm not positive what he means. I have some suspicions of what he means by that. But to say that a religion is a public religion, now, you would think that every religion, or at least most religions, appeal for converts, thereby, in some sense, making it a political, or not a political, but a public religion. Right. But I think he probably has a little deeper political intent here in making that kind of statement.
Well, I think the Roman Catholic Church has made it quite clear. They're very political. The Pope is involved in all kinds of politics around the world as far as that's concerned. Well, what's the third one here? It says that Catholic moral teachings are at times in complex relationship to the social world of politics. In other words, there's a lot of political things out here, but they have moral teachings, and that somehow those need to get involved with one another.
Well, yes, and you're going to have always a conflict, especially in democratic societies. You're going to have the conflict between religion and government. It is inevitable. And it is also inevitable that at times each is going to transgress on the territory of the others. So this is not an unusual conflict, but given the historical nature of where the Roman Catholic Church has been over the centuries, it does make it a little more important, I think, for discussion to understand exactly what this man means by that comment.
Right. We're grateful for the United States Constitution that guarantees religious freedom for us today. And, we've found, I think, in the United States, the most successful model to make peace between the civil and the religious worlds that we live in. All you need to do is take a look across those big ponds and you go to some very fanatical religious governments that none of us would want to live in, that's for sure. But this fourth one is the most interesting one, Steve. And he says, finally, despite the repeated cry that morality can't be legislated, we want to come back to that little issue. Right. It says, all citizens support the outlawing of murder, lying, and stealing, which are all prohibited by the Ten Commandments. What he's really saying is, we are already legislating the Ten Commandments, so why can't we legislate all of the Ten Commandments? What's wrong with legislating moral issues? Well, there is some truth to what he says, but there's some real danger here.
Well, I think that we have always, in the concept, at least in this country, of the separation of church and state, have said that the government does have responsibility, as any reasonable person would say, that the government has certain responsibility to legislate in what would be considered moral issues. Certainly the government has the right to say that a person should not murder someone else. That is both a civil and a moral issue.
Right.
There are certain things that human beings, there's a certain decency to human behavior that has to be legislated by the civil authorities.
Right.
But then, of course, there's this whole other area about moral judgment. And it does seem that he is indicating that this broader area also is open for civil government to take control, as it's led and encouraged by church groups, to make certain moral decisions. In fact, he comes back a little later and he helps define what he means by that.
Well, I think the government should have a right to legislate issues between human beings on a horizontal level. For instance, the last 6 of the Ten Commandments, and he appeals to the Ten Commandments, and that's been a big issue in the news. He appeals to the Ten Commandments, but the Ten Commandments really have, the last 6 really deal with human relationships. And I think the government has a right to be concerned about human relationships. Where the real danger is that they use that assumption and then move into the first 4 commandments and start legislating man's relationship with his God. They start legislating worship and those kinds of things. Steve, that takes us back to the Dark Ages if we go there, and here is the hidden danger in all of this. Yes, we've got to be civil and have certain issues resolved, but are we going to step over? Where's the stopping point at this point?
Well,
and if they're not careful, we'll be in real trouble.
Well, it seems what he is indicating in making these recommendations to Roman Catholics as they start to vote in the U.S. election is to consider that there are things that they need to vote for based on moral principles.
Right.
But he does not draw a circle around those moral principles, as you have just indicated, probably should be drawn, is that there are certain areas in which morality can be legislated, lying, murdering, those kinds of things, stealing. But there are certain areas where the government needs to keep its hands off. It seems to be that this individual is recommending that Roman Catholics, when they vote, don't need to stand within that circle, but they need to consider the whole relationship of people between a person and God, and vote for people that will help them legislate those kinds of things.
Right. For instance, abortion might be one thing. Sunday legislation would be a whole other issue altogether.
Sure, those kinds of things. You know, he continues on. He says, what cannot be legislated? Now, this is where he draws the line, not as you just did a moment ago. But he says that what cannot be legislated, or legislated with much success, are moral issues on which there is not a consensus sufficient to allow effective enforcement.
How does that compare to the Constitution of the United States?
Well, what he's saying is, if you don't have 51% of people that are going to vote for you, well, let that moral issue slide by. But if you can get a majority of people to vote with you, then go ahead and legislate on those issues that deal with the relationship between a person and their God. He says, if you can get the majority on your side, go ahead and legislate those things. And he's appealing to Catholics to take that in consideration when they go into the polls. And when they can get 51%, then, hey, let's see if we can get these things voted, and then let's legislate on those issues.
Let's contrast that, Steve. That was really a good analysis. Let's contrast that to the Constitution that guarantees minority rights. In other words, if you don't have the rule of the majority on your side, certain rights are still protected, and one of those rights is religious freedom. And I'm so grateful, for religious freedom. So we are really if they don't define this carefully, we're going to be on dangerous ground here. You can be on dangerous ground by not making sure we have good laws that regulate between human beings. And certainly I would agree with the concern on the unborn. The unborn need protection in today's world, of course. But what about my worship and my day of worship and all of those issues? Mm-hmm. Will they flow over into that? If he got it 51%, he would.
That's what he seems to indicate. Now, the evangelicals are also on the other side doing the same type of thing.
Yeah, interesting.
In fact, they're the National Association of Evangelicals. They have issued a document that is called For the Health of the Nation, an evangelical call to civil responsibility. And this, of course, is stirring a great deal of controversy, as would be expected, because it's coming from the evangelical community. But they're taking the same approach and telling their people to go out and vote on these moral issues that transcend the traditional area of civil government, really asking people to vote on issues that have to do with a person's relationship with their God.
Mm. And that's, so whether you're evangelical or whether you're Roman Catholic, these things are coming together. In other words, between the Roman Catholics and the evangelicals, there's developing a center of political influence where religion is driving the agenda. And it may not be some of these issues that probably most of us as Christians would agree with that regulate the human relationships between one another, but it also can get into the areas of our worship, and then we can have those freedoms taken away. We could be back in the dark ages if this thing is taken far enough. I know most people would say that would be alarmist, but I don't think so if we understand Bible prophecy correctly.
Right. Well, guidelines in this document, this evangelical document,
yes.
Urge evangelicals to vote biblically
now, how far
on issues like poverty, abortion, stem cell research, and same-sex marriages. Now, while on the one hand, there may be many in the Christian community that certainly have opinions based on these things and want to have certain guidelines within their church community.
Right.
But what they're asking for here is for individuals to go out and vote on specific moral issues that transcend the traditional issues of civil government. That gets into a real controversial issue, and it is a difficult thing. But we do know that when government gets to the place where those that are in power are legislating on these moral issues, that where do you draw the line? And this is the real problem. Where do you stop government making judgment on these kinds of things and interfering with the religious behavior of its citizens?
Well, we want to guarantee religious freedom, Steve. We're just about out of time here, but safeguarding our religious freedoms and understanding the fine distinctions is so important. We hope people will study their Bibles and appreciate the golden rule. That means we treat everybody the way we'd want it to be treated. That's how religious freedom is based, on which it is based.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today on World Prophecy News. We wish God's richest blessing in your life. I'm Steve Gallimore.
I'm Jay Gallimore.